The Force is old and full of shadows.
The Jedi Temple hangar at night. Emergency lighting bathed the Duracrete in deep red, the color of something not yet decided. The gunships sat in their berths like patient animals, their running lights extinguished. Beyond the transparasteel panels, Coruscant's skyline burned with 10,000 colors. The city that never dimmed, never quieted, never stopped moving. Indifferent to the fact that the galaxy was about to change, Anakin Skywalker stood in the center of the hangar floor and tried to hold himself together. His hands would not stop shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, willing the trembling to stop the way he willed the Force into everything. Habit. Discipline. A Jedi's reflex. It didn't work. The Force around him was not still. He could feel it the way a man standing in a river feels the current against his legs, pressing, insistent, carrying something enormous just beneath the surface. A held breath before a scream. Mace Windu had not yet turned around. He stood 10 paces ahead, one hand raised to signal the 3 council members behind him, Kit Fisto, Agen Kolar, Ceci Tien, to hold. The purple blade was already back on his belt. His robes were dark in the red light. "If what you have told me is true," Mace said without turning, "you will have gained my trust." A pause that felt like the space between a lightning strike and the thunder. Wait in the council chambers. Anakin's jaw tightened. For one heartbeat, one terrible, familiar heartbeat, the old reflex rose. The one that had been building for years under the weight of every dismissal, every closed council door, every time he'd stood before men who'd known him since he was 9 years old, and still looked at him like he was the thing they needed to manage, rather than the person they'd made him. The reflex said, "You see? You see what they think of you?" He closed his eyes. Not to shut the feeling out, to let it pass through him. What came instead was Padmé's voice, quiet, surfacing from some memory he hadn't known he was keeping. Her face in soft light, her hand against his cheek, and the words she'd said to him after Jabim, after one of the missions he'd come back from half-broken, and too proud to say so. "You're the bravest man I know, Anakin. Not because you're not afraid, because you go anyway." He exhaled. He opened his eyes. And then Anakin Skywalker, Knight of the Jedi Order, hero with no fear, did something he had not done in longer than he could remember. He bowed. A full, formal bow, not a nod, not the half-measure he'd given 100 times in chambers when his body performed the gesture while his mind argued against it. Head lowered, both hands open at his sides, the bow of a Padawan who meant it. "I trust you, Master." The words were quiet. They did not cost him nothing. They cost him everything he had left in that moment, which was exactly why they were true. Mace felt it. He had spent 20 years honing himself into an instrument precise enough to sense the currents of the Force in a crowded room, in a battlefield, in the space between words. What he felt now was not subtle. The storm that had been gathering around Anakin Skywalker for years, not darkness, not the dark side, but the specific turbulence of a person fighting himself, a pressure system of grief and secrecy and love and terror held in permanent standoff, simply stopped. What replaced it was clean, bright, specific, unambiguous. Mace stopped walking. He turned, fully, not halfway, and looked at Anakin the way he had not permitted himself to look at the boy in a long time. Without the filter of suspicion. Without the preloaded category of volatile asset, insufficient trust, potential threat. Just the young man standing in the red light, with his hands finally still. Who had come to him tonight with the most dangerous truth in the galaxy when every other instinct he possessed must have screamed at him to run. Behind Mace, Kit Fisto's expression shifted, something warm and quick crossing his amphibious features. He said nothing yet, but the quality of his silence changed. "No, Skywalker," Mace's voice was not soft. It was something more useful than soft, it was certain. He took 3 steps back toward Anakin and stopped close enough that he was speaking to him, not at him. "You are the chosen one. You're coming with us." Agen Kolar's chin lifted sharply. Ceci Tien's eyes moved between Mace and Anakin with a Jedi's quick recalculation. And Kit Fisto. Kit, who had sat in council sessions and watched this boy be managed and handled and half-trusted for 3 years of war, stepped forward one pace and said, simply and without ceremony, "Good." The gunship smelled of coolant and recycled air, and the faint electrical tang of systems held it ready. The 5 of them sat in the troop bay as the temple fell away beneath them, Coruscant's endless light rising to meet the viewport. The city looked peaceful from up here. It always did. Mace sat across from Anakin. He did not look out the viewport. "Skywalker," Anakin met his eyes. "The council doubted you long before you gave us reason to." Mace said it the way he said everything, directly, without decoration, the words placed like objects on a table. "We assigned our fear to your potential and called it caution. That was our failure, not yours." A beat. "It ends tonight." Anakin was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing his words carefully. The silence of someone who had waited a very long time to not have to choose them at all. "I used to need to hear that," he said finally. "I don't know if I need it now." Something crossed Mace Windu's face that might, on another man, have been called a smile. "You don't," he agreed. "Which is exactly why I'm saying it." The gunship banked, and the Senate district rose ahead of them. The Republic Executive Building lit against the dark, the Chancellor's office gleaming on its upper tier like something placed there deliberately for the galaxy to look up at. Anakin looked at it. He had stood in that office hundreds of times. He knew the angles of the light at this hour, the way the transparisteel caught Coruscant's ambient glow, the precise chair where the man who had orchestrated the deaths of millions liked to sit and smile. He looked at it without flinching. The force around him was a still lake. Agent Kolar checked his lightsaber's power cell and reclipped it to his belt. Sissy Tin rolled his head slowly on his thick neck, loose and ready. Kit Fisto glanced at Anakin once more, a look that carried something Anakin recognized, distantly, as the specific solidarity of soldiers going into something they might not walk back from, and nodded. Once. Anakin nodded back. Mace Windu rose as the gunship began its descent, moving to the bay doors. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and the purple hilt resting at his hip, and the weight of the moment sitting on him the way it always sat on Mace. Not like a burden, like ballast, like a thing that made him more precisely himself. The bay doors began to open. The night air of Coruscant rushed in, carrying the distant white noise of 10 trillion lives being lived in ignorance of this moment. 5 Jedi stood at the threshold. Below them, the Senate district spread in every direction, and the lights of the Republic burned, and somewhere in the building rising ahead of them, Darth Sidious was still waiting for a boy who was not coming. The boy who came instead stepped forward into the night air with his eyes open and his hands steady, and the force behind him like a tide that had finally found its shore. The gunship doors sealed shut beneath them, Palpatine's private office at the apex of the executive building. The wide arc of transparisteel windows framed Coruscant's skyline like a painting commissioned to remind visitors of scale, of how small they were, and how high he sat above them. The room breathed in dark reds and ancient wood tones, everything chosen to communicate permanence, power that had always been here, power that would always remain. He stood with his back to the doors. This was deliberate. It always was. The Chancellor of the Galactic Republic did not turn to greet people. People turned to face him. Even now, even at this hour, with the faint wrongness he had been sensing in the Force for the last 40 minutes, a disturbance he had catalogued and filed and set aside, because disturbances could be managed. Disturbances were the medium in which he worked. He stood at the viewport with his hands clasped behind his back and let the skyline do what it was designed to do. He had been expecting one set of footsteps. He heard 5. His hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened. One finger pressing into the opposite knuckle, a stillness that cost something to maintain. 13 years. The patience of a man who had spent 13 years threading a needle in the dark, who had built this war from a single assassination attempt on a Queen's transport, and turned it into the instrument that would break the Republic from the inside, and remake it as something that would last 10,000 years. 13 years reduced, in this moment, to the count of 5 sets of boots crossing the threshold behind him. He turned. Anakin stood at the front. Not behind Mace Windu. Not to the side. Angled slightly back the way a junior partner stands when he's been brought along. Shoulder to shoulder with the Council Master, a half step forward if anything, his blue blade already ignited and held low. Not threatening, not yet, but present. Final. The posture of a man who had already made his decision in some other room and arrived here with nothing left to decide. Palpatine's eyes moved to Anakin's face. He had studied that face for 13 years. He knew the tells, the slight tension at the jaw when the boy was frightened and performing calm, the particular set of the brow when grief was being converted in real time into the anger that was so much easier to carry. He had learned to play those tells the way a musician learns an instrument, lightly, precisely, with the confidence of someone who understood the mechanism completely. He looked at Anakin's face and found none of them. What he found instead was clarity, not the hard-edged, brittle clarity of a man holding himself together, the clear, still, particular quality of a man who had set something down. The boy's eyes were blue and calm and completely, devastatingly present. No fear in them. No conflict. No the war I am fighting with myself that Sidious had been carefully stoking for 3 years like a fire that needed tending. Just Anakin Skywalker, looking at him. The rehearsed line. He had prepared it, of course, had run the variables and selected the approach most likely to fracture whatever thin alliance Mace might have built. The opening that would put Anakin between two competing loyalties and let the boy's own interior chaos do the work rose to the surface of his mind. It died there. He did not speak it. Because it required a crack to work through, and there was no crack. The boy standing in his doorway was not a divided thing anymore, and the tactic that had worked 100 times in 100 forms. In Senate chambers and private meetings and late-night conversations designed to feel like friendship, required division to function. The silence stretched for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Sheev Palpatine, Darth Sidious, Dark Lord of the Sith, Master of the Sith Grand Plan, Architect of the Clone Wars, looked at Anakin Skywalker and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific cold of a man who has miscalculated. Then he let the mask go. It did not fall dramatically, it did not crack or shatter, it simply withdrew, like a tide going out. The warmth, the grandfatherly concern, the carefully constructed patina of the mentor who had believed in Anakin when no one else did, all of it receded. And what remained was older and colder and infinitely more dangerous. The eyes that looked out from Palpatine's face now were not the Chancellor's eyes. They were yellow at the edges. They had been yellow at the edges for a very long time. So, he said. One word, the voice already different, lower, scraping, the gravel of something ancient surfacing through the cultivated tone he had worn for decades. His gaze moved from Anakin to Mace Windu, measured the room, counted what he had to work with. The Jedi have come to arrest their Chancellor. The Jedi have come to arrest a Sith Lord, Mace said. No heat in it, the flat certainty of a man reading a fact aloud. Palpatine's mouth curved. Not a smile. The shape a smile made when everything behind it was something else entirely. His right hand moved. The desk, solid Alderanian hardwood, 300 years old. The kind of object selected because it communicated that the man behind it was the kind of man who kept things for 300 years, came up off the floor as though it weighed nothing. It crossed the room like a projectile, spinning flat, aimed not at Mace but at Kit Fisto and Aegon Kolar on the left flank, forcing a split-second choice, scatter or take the impact. They scattered. The red blade ignited in the same motion. It was not the theatrical draw of a man performing villainy for an audience. It was the draw of someone who had trained with this weapon for 4 decades, for whom the ignition and the first killing strike were a single continuous movement with no pause between intent and execution. The crimson blade swept toward the gap the desk had opened in their formation. Fast, precise, a scalpel looking for the seam. Anakin was already moving. His blue blade caught the red 1-3 centimeters from Kit Fisto's shoulder, and the impact rang through the office like a struck bell. He didn't stop the strike so much as redirect it, letting the momentum carry the red blade wide and down the way Jem So was built to do, not blocking, converting, the parry already becoming the counter before Palpatine could reset his wrist. For one fraction of a second, the two of them were close. Red light and blue light competing across both their faces. Palpatine looked at him. Anakin looked back. And Sidious pivoted, mid-motion, mid-breath, abandoning the physical press and shifting into something else entirely. His voice dropped into the register he had spent years perfecting, the one that had worked in 1,000 quiet rooms and late-night confidences, rich with manufactured urgency. Anakin, still using the name, still trying the instrument even with the mask gone, because old habits were the last things to die. Everything I told you was true. Her death. The dream. I am the only living being in this galaxy with the power to stop it. You know this. You feel it. Walk away from this room with me. Walk away right now, and she lives. She lives, and your children live. And everything you've been afraid to want. Her fate is with the Force. Anakin said. Not you. Ice cold, not a refusal born in anger, not the hot rejection of a man convincing himself. The flat, immovable statement of someone who had already stood in the fire this argument represented and come out the other side. The words landed in the room like a door closing. Something moved through Palpatine's expression. Not pain. Nothing so human as pain. But the specific recalibration of a strategist watching a variable become a constant. The boy was not his anymore. Perhaps a cold voice in the back of his ancient mind suggested. The boy had never been entirely his in the ways that mattered. The fury that replaced calculation was not performed. It came from somewhere genuine and bottomless. The rage of a man who had spent a millennium of Sith patience and tradition on a grand plan that had just been walked through by a 22-year-old, who chose trust over fear at the last possible moment. The red blade came up. Blue and green rose to meet it. The first true clash of the engagement hit like a thunderclap. And the viewport behind Palpatine fractured along one edge, a single crack splitting the transparent steel from corner to corner, Coruscant's endless light pouring through the gap. The broken prophecy had already come to pass. It had happened not in this room, not with lightsabers drawn, but in a hangar 20 minutes ago, in the silence after a bow. Everything else was consequence. Palpatine's office in the first minute of the fight, the wide arc of transparent steel behind him shedding Coruscant's light in fractured angles across the floor, the furniture already wrecked, the air carrying the hot ozone smell of 3 lightsabers running hot in a closed space. 5 Jedi. 1 Sith Lord. The math looked simple. It wasn't. Sidious moved through the office the way water moves through a broken hull, not fighting the space, using it. The crimson blade a constant blur of Juyo ferocity that turned every attempt at a coordinated press into a series of individual problems. He did not fight 5 opponents. He fought one opponent at a time, in sequence, faster than the sequence could be anticipated, using the room's angles and the Jedi's own formations against them. A desk fragment caught Sissy Tian across the shoulder. A force-hurled statue forced Kolar back 2 steps. 2 steps that opened a gap that the red blade immediately occupied. Mace felt it immediately. The geometry of the fight was wrong. He pulled back half a step, not retreating, reading, and let Anakin take the direct press while he watched Sidious's footwork. Vapad demanded this. The form was not built on aggression alone. It was built on comprehension, absorbing the opponent's ferocity so completely that the ferocity became information, and the information became ammunition. Mace let the fury of Sidious's opening barrage wash over him like weather and catalogued everything inside it. Speed, extraordinary, beyond what the briefings had suggested, beyond what any living Jedi had reported facing. Technique, Juyo at its theoretical ceiling, the form stripped of all separation between intent and strike, no wind-ups, no telegraphing. Every attack arriving without the mechanical preparation a trained reflex could catch, and underneath it, feeding it, fueling it, rage, ancient, immense, and absolutely genuine. Mace filed this away and smiled, just slightly, where Sidious couldn't see it. Good. Anakin drove forward with a gem-so combination that would have ended most fights. 3 connected strikes, each converting the rebound of the last into the momentum of the next. The kind of sequence that turned physical strength into something closer to inevitability. Sidious took the first two on his blade and sidestepped the third with a precision that should not have been possible for a man his age, pivoting inside Anakin's guard and snapping a force push at close range that hit like a speeder bike. Anakin went back 4 steps. Stayed upright. Reset. Kit Fisto moved into the gap Anakin's stumble created, pressing from the left with the fluid, adaptive style that made him dangerous in close quarters. His blade work was fast and unpredictable, each strike coming from a slightly different angle than the one before. Sidious redirected the first 3 with contemptuous efficiency, and then, between the third and the fourth, found the angle. The red blade went through the gap between Kit's third strike and his recovery. Not deep, not fatal. But it caught him across the upper arm in a line of scorched flesh, and Kit's grip on his saber faltered, for 1/2 second. 1/2 second in which he stepped back to recalibrate. Sidious was already gone, already moving, already in the new geometry of the fight where Aegon Kolar stood. It was fast. That was the only mercy of it. Kolar was good, a strong practitioner, a proven survivor of 100 engagements. In any other fight, against any other opponent, he would have handled the turn. But Sidious didn't telegraph. There was no wind-up, no shift in footwork, no microsecond of mechanical preparation that a trained Jedi's reflexes could catch. There was Kolar's blade in the ready position, and then there was the red blade through it, and then there was the floor. Mace heard it. Anakin heard it. Neither of them stopped moving. That was the discipline. Not the absence of grief, but the postponement of it. The ability to seal the wound and keep fighting, because stopping was its own kind of death. But something changed in Anakin's next strike. Not anger. Heavier than anger. The specific weight of a man who has been reminded, once more, of the cost of being right about something. Sissy Teen came in hard from the right. He was the most physically powerful of the remaining group besides Anakin. And he fought like it, wide, committed strikes designed to batter through guard rather than find gaps. Sidious shifted to meet him, and for 3 seconds it looked like the press was working, like Teen's raw power was finally forcing the Sith Lord onto pure defense. Sidious gathered the force in both hands without breaking his blade work. The burst came in the middle of Teen's 4th committed downstroke, a full-body force blast, close range, the kind of power expenditure that cost something even from Sidious. But the cost was acceptable, because Teen's downstroke meant his weight was committed forward, and there was nowhere for the blast to go except through him. Teen hit the far wall. He did not get up. 3 Jedi. The office smelled of ozone and scorched stone, and something metallic underneath it all. The transparasteel viewport had shed 2 more fracture lines across its face. Coruscant's light came through in broken shafts, striping the floor in cold white between the red glow of the blade. Sidious reset his stance and looked at what remained. Mace Windu. Anakin Skywalker, Kit Fisto, arm burned and stance adjusted but still present, still in the fight, blade up. He looked longest at Anakin. The manipulation was already forming. Mace could see it in the fractional relaxation of Sidious's shoulders, the specific quality of the pause before a man who has decided to try a different instrument. The blade stayed up. The voice dropped. Anakin, the name landed differently in Sidious's mouth now, stripped of the warmth the Chancellor's voice had always carried, but trying for something raw, something that bypassed the cultivated patina and reached for the wound directly. 2 Jedi Masters are dead. How many more before you understand that this institution, this order that has used you and doubted you and kept you in chains your entire life, is not worth what it is costing you tonight? Anakin pressed forward, and Sidious's blade came up, and the next exchange was 4 strikes in 2 seconds, all of them blocked, all of them harder than the ones before. Anakin wasn't answering with words. He was answering with his feet, closing distance, refusing the reset, not letting the voice have the room it needed to work. Sidious tried the other angle. I can still save her. Quieter now. Intimate. The way a knife is intimate. Whatever Windu has told you, whatever bargain you think you've made tonight, she is still going to die on that table, screaming your name. And I am still the only being in this galaxy who can prevent it. Let me go. Walk away. She lives. Isn't she worth more than Her fate is with the Force, Anakin said. Not you. No heat. No performance. The statement of a man who had already survived the argument this line of attack was based on, who had stood in a hangar 20 minutes ago and made a choice that meant this particular weapon had no edge left. It landed insidious like a door closing permanently. What replaced the calculation was genuine. The fury that came through in the next assault dropped all pretense of economy and became something rawer, faster, wilder, the ancient bottomless rage of a man who has spent 1,000 years of patient darkness watching it undone in a single night. By a boy who chose to trust. More fuel for Vapad. Mace stepped fully in. The fight changed. Sidious felt it, felt the shift in Mace's blade work from reactive to something else, something that was taking his escalating fury and not deflecting it but drinking it, building on it, returning it in concentrated form with compound interest attached. The more he poured in, the more came back. The angrier and darker he became, the more precisely Mace moved, the more dangerous each counter. Sidious, for the first time, was losing the tempo. Anakin felt the shift too, felt Mace's rhythm, and matched it the way a partner matches a step, instinctively, without needing to speak it. This was the combination they had never practiced and didn't need to. Gemso and Vapad interlocking not because they were designed for each other, but because the two men wielding them trusted each other completely. And trust at this speed, in this space, was its own form of technique. Anakin drove a full committed Gemso strike at Sidious's left, wide, low, deliberately overextended in a way that would have been reckless alone. Because he knew, without looking, that Mace was already covering the gap it opened. Sidious took the bait. He had to. The strike demanded a full two-handed block to absorb the force of it, both hands committed, both arms dropping into the parry. His right flank opened for exactly one heartbeat. Mace's blade was already there. 2 clean arcs. 1 motion. Sidious's hands hit the floor separately from the lightsaber he'd been holding, and the red blade rolled away and extinguished against the broken stone. The scream that followed was not pain. It was older than pain. It was the sound of a grand plan expiring, of 1,000 years of Sith patience hitting the floor of a government office at midnight, in chains, mutilated, delegitimized, reduced to a howling ruin that 2 Jedi were already moving to contain. Kit Fisto pressed the restraint cuffs home. Mace stood over the fallen Sith Lord and did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had done a necessary thing and was already calculating what came next. Anakin stood beside him, breathing hard, blade still lit. He looked at the thing on the floor that had called itself his friend, his father, his salvation, and felt none of the things it had promised he would feel without it. What he felt instead was the Force. Still, clear, his own. The executive building corridor outside the Chancellor's office. Marble floors and high ceilings built to make men feel small. The architecture of institutional permanence now lit in the flickering amber of emergency strip lighting that had triggered automatically when the main power to the office suite surged and cut during the fight. 3 Republic Senate guards stood frozen at the corridor's far end, hands not quite on their weapons, staring at what was coming toward them. What was coming toward them was Darth Sidious in binders. Kit Fisto had one arm. Mace had the other. The Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, mutilated robes torn, his face a mask of cold fury that had abandoned every pretense of the warmth the galaxy had known for 13 years, moved between them with the rigid, precise gait of a man choosing how to be seen even now. Even like this, even with both hands gone and the cuff's suppression field pressing against the Force like a wall of static, Mace looked at the Senate guards. "Stand down," he said. "This man is under arrest by order of the Jedi Council pending Republic Tribunal. You will stand down, or you will be obstructing justice in a matter of galactic security. Choose now." The guard stood down. Mace did not slow his pace. He had made the decision before the fight ended. Had made it, in truth, before the gunship landed, in the space between Anakin's bow and the bay doors opening. The decision was not complicated once you stripped away the adrenaline and the years of philosophical debate about Jedi authority and civilian oversight. A dead Sith Lord, was a martyr. A dead Palpatine was a mystery. A vacuum, a body that his loyalists could build a mythology around for the next century. A captured one was a confession. Let the galaxy see him. Let the Senate see what had been sitting in the highest office in the Republic for 13 years, managing them, directing them, engineering the war that had consumed 1 million lives on both sides, because both sides answered to the same hand. Let them see it in chains, without the mask, unable to perform its way out of what the evidence already made irrefutable. No execution. Not tonight. Tonight, the most powerful weapon available was the image of Palpatine alive and bound, walking out of his own office in suppression cuffs, and the hollow drones were already gathering outside. Mace could see their running lights through the corridor windows, the press corps that kept permanent vigil over the executive building's exterior. Drawn by the power surge and the emergency lighting, and the instinct that had kept journalists alive since the first beings had learned to read the sky for weather, he let them gather. They emerged onto the building's secondary landing platform into a wall of artificial light, and the distant sound of 100 simultaneous comms opening as journalists 17 floors below registered what their drone feeds were transmitting. Sidious said nothing. His face in the hollow drone light was ancient and cold, and completely deliberately composed. Even now he was managing his image, choosing the frame he would occupy, refusing to give them the howling ruin that had screamed on the office floor. Mace noted this without surprise. The performance never stopped. That was what you were dealing with. That was what the galaxy needed to understand it had been dealing with. Kit Fisto guided Sidious toward the security transport that Mace had commed ahead for during the fight's final 30 seconds. The transport's doors sealed. The hollow drones swarmed it like moths. Anakin was already gone. 500 Republica. A residential tower in the Senate district built for the kind of people whose security requirements made standard buildings impractical. The apartment on the upper floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked west across the city, and at this hour the view was all amber and violet, the permanent artificial twilight of Coruscant at its most disarmingly beautiful. Padmé Amidala answered the door in 4 seconds, which meant she had been awake and near it, which meant she had already seen something on the news feeds that had made sleep impossible. She looked at Anakin's face and did not say anything for a moment. She had spent 3 years learning to read what he let through and what he didn't, and what she read now was different from anything the previous 3 years had prepared her for. Not the controlled mask, not the manufactured comm. Something raw and more fundamental. The specific look of a man who has just done the hardest thing he has ever done, and is only now, in the aftermath, beginning to feel the full weight of it. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The apartment was quiet. The city moved beyond the glass, oblivious. He stood in the center of her living room and said, "I need to tell you everything." So he did. He started with Fives, the ARC trooper who had died 14 months ago, trying to tell anyone who would listen about the chips, about the contingency, about the thing buried in every clone soldier's skull that no one in the Republic had wanted to hear about, because the timing was bad, and the source was a single soldier with a breakdown on record. Anakin had heard him. Had not known what to do with what he'd heard. Had filed it in the place where he put the things he couldn't fix, and kept moving. Because the war required motion, and the alternative was standing still long enough to feel how much was wrong. Then he told her about the dreams. Her face in darkness. Her voice fading. The specific geometry of the nightmare that had repeated every time he closed his eyes for months. Not vague dread, but precise, detailed. The kind of vision the Force didn't send without meaning it. Her expression did not change while he spoke. It held. Careful, present, absorbing, he told her about Palpatine. Every conversation. Every late-night meeting in the office with the wide windows. Every careful word chosen to sit between friendship and something else. The offer that had been extended slowly over years, until it felt like the only lifeline in a flood he hadn't noticed himself drowning in. The promise. The power. The word Plagueis spoken in a Senate opera box like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He told her about the choice he had almost made. Almost. The hangar. The moment. The 4 seconds when Mace Windu walked away and Anakin stood alone with everything the man had told him, and everything he stood to lose, and the choice between the two. Then he told her about the bow. He had been talking for 11 minutes. He knew because the chrono on her wall was visible from where he stood, and he had been watching it the way you watch something when you need an anchor that isn't your own heartbeat. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" she said. "Have you been carrying this alone?" Not a question. The inflection of someone identifying a fact they already knew and needed to say aloud. "Long enough," he said. She looked at him. The particular look that had cut through every version of his armor since he was 9 years old, and she was a queen, and he was a boy from a desert who had never seen water falling from the sky. The look that simply, flatly refused to accept the performance and waited for the person underneath it. "You should have told me," she said, "about the dreams, about what he was offering." "I would have. I know. Anakin, I know." The 2 words carrying everything the longer version would have taken minutes to say. The acknowledgement, the guilt, the understanding that the secrecy had been its own kind of fear, and the fear had been its own kind of loyalty to the thing she deserved better than. She crossed the room and took his hands. Both of them. Her grip was certain. "Then let's make sure this ends the right way," she said. "Not just the fast way." He looked at her. "Mace Windu will move within hours," she continued, and her voice had shifted into the register he had watched command Senate floors and negotiate peace treaties and talk armed men out of violence, clear, precise, already several steps ahead. "He'll frame tonight as a Jedi coup before the morning feeds. He has the succession clauses memorized and loyalists on 6 key committees." A beat. "But Bail is already awake. I saw his comm light go active 20 minutes ago. And Mon Mothma has been waiting for provable grounds for 2 years. You were already planning," Anakin said. "I'm always already planning." She said it without apology. "The question was always when you'd give me something I could actually use." He looked at her, this woman who had spent 3 years being protected from the truth, who had just absorbed 11 minutes of things that should have taken the ground out from under her, and was already building the next structure on top of them. The stone that had been sitting in his chest since the opera box, since the dreams, since long before that, the specific weight of a secret kept in the dark, was not gone. But it was no longer his alone to carry. She was already reaching for her comm. Outside, the hollow drones were multiplying over the Senate district, and the feeds were live. And the galaxy was beginning to understand that something irrevocable had happened tonight in an office 40 floors above the street. The 2 of them stood at her window, hand in hand, and watched it begin. The Senate Rotunda at dawn. 10,000 delegation pods suspended in the vast cylindrical chamber, the central speaking platform rising from the floor like an altar to the specific religion of collective governance. The rotunda's acoustics were engineered to carry a single voice to every corner of the room without amplification, a design choice made 1,000 years ago by architects who believed in the power of an unmediated human voice reaching an unmediated human ear. This morning, that design was being tested. The feeds had been running for 3 hours. Every major holonews network in the core had the image by now, Palpatine in suppression cuffs, emerging from his own building into drone light. The face that had smiled from 1,000 Senate broadcasts for 13 years reduced to something ancient and cold, and entirely without the warmth the galaxy thought it knew. The image was 18 seconds long. It had already been viewed 400 million times. The rotunda was not calm. Mace Windu reached the central platform first. This was intentional. Palpatine's vice chair was a tall, blue-skinned Chagrian with leathers that moved when he was agitated, and this morning they had not been still since he entered the chamber. He had spent the pre-dawn hours on comms, activating every loyalty he had accumulated in 13 years of proximity to power, and what he had assembled was not nothing. A block of perhaps 60 delegations who answered to Senate committees that Palpatine's office had quietly controlled through funding allocation and appointment pressure. 60 delegations, in a chamber of 1,000, was not a majority. But 60 organized voices in a room full of chaos could set the narrative before the opposition found its footing. Amidala understood this. He moved to the platform and opened his mouth. "Senators of the Republic, His voice filled the chamber, practiced and authoritative. What occurred in the early hours of this morning constitutes an unprecedented act of aggression against the office of the Supreme Chancellor and against the democratic foundations of the Republic itself. The Jedi Order, operating without Senate authorization, without judicial warrant, and without civilian oversight, has detained our duly elected Chancellor by force of arms. The noise from the chamber was immediate and enormous. Padmé was already moving. She had entered the rotunda through the Naboo delegation's private corridor 40 seconds before Amidala took the platform, and she had not gone to her pod. She was on the floor, moving between delegation clusters with the focused efficiency of someone who had mapped this room's social architecture over 9 years of service and knew exactly which conversations needed to happen in which order. Bail Organa was working the other side of the chamber. Mon Mothma had taken the committee anteroom where 6 key delegation chairs had agreed. At 2 a.m, to hear what she had to say before the session opened. Padmé reached Senator Tyrrell of Corellia, a cautious man, a proceduralist, someone whose first instinct in any crisis was to find the legally defensible position and occupy it. "The evidence brief," she said, without preamble. He looked at the data chip she was holding. "Senator Amidala, the timing of this. The timing is exactly right. And you know it." She kept her voice low and even. Amidala is building a narrative in real time on that platform. Every minute we wait is a minute that narrative calcifies. The brief contains financial records, not Jedi testimony, not force readings, not anything that requires you to take anyone's word for anything. Transactions, ledgers, Republic Treasury disbursements, cross-referenced with Confederacy of Independent Systems procurement records. She held his gaze. The same hand signed both sets of authorizations. "Read the brief or don't, but decide now, because I have 11 more conversations to have in the next 4 minutes." Tyrrell took the chip. She was already moving. Amidala's voice continued to fill the upper chamber. The block of 60 was coordinated, their response systems lighting the delegation board in a pattern of synchronized support that was designed to look organic and wasn't. He was good at this, had been the operational engine behind Palpatine's Senate management for over a decade, and the machine he was running now was the same machine, just missing its architect. But the architect had built it to serve one purpose, and the purpose was gone, and the machine was already showing the seams. Bail Organa's voice entered the chamber from the Alderaan pod, calm and carrying. Point of parliamentary procedure. Not a speech, a lever. Under Senate Resolution 2941, any motion to invoke emergency succession clauses requires a verified quorum of senior committee chairs, not general floor support. I move that Vice Chair Amidala demonstrate quorum before this chamber proceeds further on any succession matter. 6 of those committee chairs were in Mon Mothma's anteroom. They were not going to answer Amidala's quorum call. The delegation board recalculated. Amidala's platform froze, not visibly, not to anyone watching the feeds, but the procedural challenge had done its work. He needed those 6 chairs, and he did not have them, and the chamber's parliamentary systems required a response within 90 seconds. Padmé returned to the Naboo pod. She keyed the pod's speaker request and rose to the platform as Amidala stepped back, not retreating, recalculating. But the distinction was irrelevant, because the platform was hers now. She had prepared nothing. She did not need to. Senators, her voice in the rotunda's acoustics, clear and unaffected. I have served in this chamber for 9 years. I have watched this body vote for war, vote to extend emergency powers, vote to expand executive authority in ways that each, individually, seemed reasonable under the circumstances, and each, individually, moved us further from the Republic we all came here to serve. The chamber was not quiet. It was never quiet. But the noise shifted, from the directed chaos of Amidala's managed response to something more complicated, more genuine. What I am presenting to this chamber now is not testimony, she continued. It is not the Jedi Order's account of events. It is financial data recovered from the Supreme Chancellor's private servers during the lawful execution of a Jedi security operation. I ask that the Chamber's own independent audit office receive this data directly, from my hands to theirs, without passing through any office currently under succession dispute. She looked at Amidala across the chamber floor. That is not a radical request. That is what evidence looks like when it has nothing to hide. She transmitted the brief to the audit office's secure channel while she was still speaking. The chamber's feeds lit up as journalists received the summary simultaneously, a coordinated release that Bale had arranged through 3 separate independent correspondents who had been given the data under embargo 2 hours earlier, and released it the moment Padmé's transmission registered. The twin ledgers. Republic Treasury authorizations bearing Palpatine's personal encryption key. Cross-referenced against Confederacy of Independent Systems weapons procurement orders bearing the same key under a shell identity. Count Dooku's financial architecture exposed at every level, every payment traceable, the entire funding structure of the Clone Wars revealed as a single closed circuit with one man at its center, paying both sides, managing both losses, engineering both victories to serve a timeline only he had known in full. The chamber's noise changed again. Not silence. The rotunda was constitutionally incapable of silence. But the quality of the sound shifted from coordinated opposition to something raw and less managed, the sound of 1,000 beings processing information that rearranged every assumption they had used to construct their understanding of the last 3 years. Amidala's delegation board began to change, not all at once. Senator Turrell of Corellia flipped first, a small light on the board. One delegation, but visible and visible things became symbols before they became numbers. 3 more followed in the next 40 seconds. Then 7. The cascade was not fast, it took 11 minutes, which in Senate terms was geological, but it was, once it began, inexorable. Mon Mothma took the platform when Padmé stepped back. And where Padmé had given them the moral architecture and the emotional credibility, Mon Mothma gave them the procedural exit, the exact parliamentary language of the emergency suspension motion, the specific clauses that transferred executive authority to a caretaker council, pending tribunal, the legal mechanism that meant no senator had to choose between their conscience and their political survival because the procedure itself was clean and defensible and had been used twice before in Republic history under less dramatic circumstances. The vote ran for 4 minutes. When the board cleared, Mas Amedda's succession claim had been suspended by a margin of 612 to 217, with 41 abstentions. Padmé stood in the Naboo pod and watched the number resolve and felt none of the things she had expected to feel. Not relief. Relief required the danger to be over, and the danger was not over. Palpatine was still alive, still in a containment cell, and she had spent enough time in rooms with him to know that alive and contained was not the same as neutralized. Something moved in the Force around the chamber. She was not Force-sensitive, had no instrument for reading it, but she had spent 3 years watching Anakin's face as he processed what the Force was telling him, and she had learned to recognize the quality of a room when something beyond the visible was also present. She did not know what it meant. She filed it, the way she filed everything she didn't yet have enough information to act on, and reached for her comm to tell Anakin that the Senate had held. The political war was won. The other thing, whatever the Force had been trying to say in that chamber, was still coming. The Republic containment facility on Coruscant's government tier. A building that did not appear on public maps, that had no visible signage, that sat between 2 administrative complexes like a held breath, its existence acknowledged in classified Senate budget line items and nowhere else. The corridors inside were white and cold, and lit with the flat, effectless luminescence of a place designed not for occupation, but for custody. Sound moved differently here. The walls absorbed it. Footsteps landed and disappeared. Voices carried only as far as they were meant to. Cell 7 had been prepared before the gunship landed. Suppression field emitters recessed into every surface, floor, ceiling, the 4 walls, generating overlapping interference patterns that compressed the Force into something like static. Not absent. A Jedi or Sith in a suppression field did not lose their connection to the Force the way a man loses sight in darkness. It was more precise than that. The connection remained, but everything beyond the immediate, the reach, the projection, the ability to extend awareness outward through the living current, compressed to the dimensions of the body itself, You could feel your own heartbeat. You could not feel anything else. The designers of the field had been thorough. They had not been thorough enough. Palpatine sat on the cell's single bench with his arms resting on his knees, his ruined wrists wrapped in the facility's standard medical foam. Temporary, functional, the kind of treatment given to a prisoner whose long-term medical needs would be addressed after the immediate security requirements were satisfied. His robes had been replaced with the facility's standard gray. The Chancellor's office, the Senate, the machinery of 13 years of careful construction, all of it was 40 floors above him and receding. He was not thinking about any of it. He was very still. The guards outside Cell 7, 6 Coruscant Guard troopers in full kit, Commander Fox at their head, had been briefed on the prisoner's status in the standard format: high value, force capable. Assume maximum threat regardless of apparent physical limitation. Fox had deployed his unit in the configuration the briefing recommended: 2 at the cell door, 2 at the corridor's near junction, 2 at the far end with sightlines on both approaches. Clean, professional, exactly what the briefing asked for. Fox himself stood at the near junction. He had been standing there for 40 minutes, and the thing he was feeling, the thing he would not have had words for if asked, because it was not the kind of thing that appeared in a clone commander's operational vocabulary, was a low, persistent wrongness. Not tactical, not anything he could locate in the geometry of the corridor or the status of his unit. Something older than that. Something that had no address. He put it down to the night's events. Unprecedented situations produced unprecedented feelings. This was manageable. Inside Cell 7, Palpatine breathed. The suppression field pressed against him from every surface, and he let it press, and he did not fight it the way a man fights a current he wants to swim against. Because fighting it was the wrong approach, and had always been the wrong approach. He had spent 60 years learning that power was not about force applied against resistance. It was about finding the one angle where resistance did not exist. The suppression field compressed his reach. It did not compress it to zero. The field's designers had calculated their tolerances based on the known parameters of force projection, the documented range of telekinetic and telepathic ability as measured in Jedi testing, which topped out at certain distances and diminished predictably across them. These were good measurements, accurate measurements, derived from genuine data. They were measurements taken from Jedi, from the documented ceiling of what a Force user of extraordinary ability could sustain and project. They had not been designed for this, for reserves this deep, this old, drawn from a well the Order had never fully mapped. The designers had calculated for projection. They had not considered what happened when the source exceeded their measurements at the single point they had assumed was safe, close-range, inward direction. A practitioner willing to spend everything he had left to move one piece on a board everyone else believed was locked away. What Palpatine reached for now was not projection in the documented sense. It was older than projection, older than the categorized abilities the Jedi had spent 10,000 years naming and measuring and filing in their archive. It was the specific dark side technique that Sith Masters had passed from one to the next across a millennium of the Rule of Two. Not communication, not command, but something closer to contagion. The ability to reach into a mind that already carried a prepared architecture and activate what was already there. The inhibitor chip in Commander Fox's skull had been there since before Fox knew what a skull was. Palpatine did not need to reach far. Fox was in the corridor. The corridor was 40 meters from the cell. 40 meters was inside the suppression field's tolerance gap. The designers had calculated for projection across kilometers, had not considered the specific case of a target this close, a channel this prepared, a practitioner this old. He found the architecture the way a man finds a door he installed himself. Fox's head moved slightly. Not a dramatic thing. Not the jerking, visible wrongness of something out of a horror serial. A slight movement of the head. A quarter turn left. The kind of adjustment a man makes when he hears something at the edge of his hearing range. His eyes did not change. His posture did not change. From the outside, from the position of the troopers at either end of the corridor, nothing about Commander Fox registered as different. Inside, everything was different. The wrongness he had been filing and managing for 40 minutes resolved suddenly into something else. Not a feeling but a shape. a structured thing. A command that did not arrive as sound or language, but as architecture already present in his nervous system, suddenly made active. Like a muscle he hadn't known he had, flexing for the first time. He did not feel compelled. That was the most disturbing aspect of it, later, in the accounting that would be made of this night. He did not feel overridden. He felt certain. He felt the specific clarity of a man who has just remembered something important that had been waiting at the edge of his awareness, and the thing he had remembered was that there were guard units across Coruscant who needed to know about a threat at the Jedi Temple, and he was the commander responsible for their coordination, and the channel to reach them was his emergency command frequency. And his hand was already moving toward it. His hand keyed the channel. The signal that went out was short and encoded, 12 characters in the Guard's internal operational cipher, the kind of burst transmission that registered on monitoring systems as routine status traffic. It carried no voice. It did not need to. The 12 characters were sufficient. Every Guard unit in Coruscant's upper levels who received it would know what it meant. In Cell 7, Palpatine exhaled. He did not open his eyes. He did not move. He remained exactly as he had been, still composed, his ruined wrists resting on his knees, the facility's gray robes carrying no distinction from any other prisoner the building had ever held. The difference was that he was not simply a prisoner anymore. He was a man who had just moved a piece on a board that everyone else in the building believed was locked away. Fox's hand dropped from the comm panel. The certainty that had moved through him withdrew like a tide, leaving him standing in the corridor with the specific blank disorientation of a man who has just performed an action he cannot fully account for. He stood still. He breathed. His training told him that disorientation in a high-stress operational environment was a known phenomenon, manageable, not a cause for alarm. He did not report the transmission. He did not remember, fully, having sent it. At the Jedi Temple, 3 kilometers north, the first alert klaxon began to sound. It was a low frequency, the facility's outer perimeter tone, the one that signaled unauthorized approach rather than confirmed breach. The duty officer at the temple's security station logged it and cross-referenced it against the evening's known traffic patterns and found an anomaly, a battalion-level movement of Coruscant Guard units converging from 3 separate staging points on approach vectors that all terminated at the temple's outer wall. The duty officer reached for the internal comm. In the corridor outside Cell 7, Commander Fox stood at his post with his hands at his sides and the knowledge of what he had done sitting somewhere below the level at which he could access it, and the wrongness he had been feeling for 40 minutes was gone now, replaced by a clean and empty quiet that felt, falsely, like calm. Palpatine breathed in the cell. The board had one more piece in motion. Level 1313. The underbelly of Coruscant's government tier, where the city's maintenance infrastructure ran in exposed conduits along ceilings 40 meters above streets that had not seen natural light in 4 centuries. The air down here was different, warmer, carrying the overlapping smells of machine lubricant and recycled atmosphere, and the specific damp that accumulated wherever moisture condensed on permacrete that never fully dried. The lighting was amber and inconsistent, pools of it separated by long stretches of near dark. Rain, somehow, fell here, not natural rain. But the condensation from the city's cooling systems, collected and channeled through drainage infrastructure that had been designed for water management, and had instead become, over centuries, a permanent artificial drizzle in the deepest inhabited levels. It fell in thin curtains between the conduit banks, catching the amber light in ways that made the darkness visible rather than absent. Mace had come in from the north approach. Anakin had come in from the east. They had not discussed the geometry. They had known, without needing to say it, how this would have to be staged. 2 approaches, the angles covering each other the way they had covered each other in the office 12 hours ago. The muscle memory of a partnership that had been forged in a single night and felt, against all reasonable expectation, like something much longer than that. They found him at the base of a maintenance access point, beneath a conduit junction that dripped steadily onto the permacrete below. He was moving, not quickly, not with the liquid precision that had made him the most dangerous combatant either of them had ever faced, but moving. The gray facility clothes were soaked through. The ruined wrists had been wrapped again, crudely, with torn fabric. He moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who is committed to a direction and is not going to stop. He heard them before they reached him. Of course he did. He stopped. Turned, the amber light caught his face from below, and the shadows it threw were not kind. Which was accurate, because kindness had never been the point of that face. What it showed now was stripped of everything the Chancellor's office had added to it over 13 years. The warmth, the accessibility, the practiced grandfatherly architecture of a man who had made a career of being underestimated. What remained was old. Genuinely, specifically, cosmically old. The kind of age that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with what a person chose to spend 60 years doing. His eyes in the amber light were entirely yellow now, no pretense left of the brown that had fooled a Senate and a Republic and a Jedi Order for a generation. "Both of you," he said. The voice, raw, scraping, stripped of the performed warmth, was somehow more itself than it had been in the office. "I wonder which of you thinks they're the main character in this story." "Neither," Mace said. Palpatine's arms came up. He had no lightsaber. His arms ended in wrapped stubs, and the wrists beneath the torn fabric were not functional, and the suppression field he had burned through had cost him in ways that were visible in the pronounced list of his stance, the shallow, controlled quality of his breathing. Pain being managed at considerable effort, rather than absent. He had come this far on reserves that should not have existed, drawn from depths of the dark side that the Jedi had never fully mapped, and what remained was less than what he had started with in Cell 7. None of this was reassuring. What erupted from him was not the precise theatrical arc of a man performing for an audience. It came from somewhere beneath technique entirely, a raw, sustained burst of dark side force energy that did not channel through fingertips, did not require hands, did not follow the structured form of any ability the Jedi had catalogued and named. It was older than those forms, cruder and more absolute, the pure outward expression of a will that had spent 1,000 years refusing to accept the limits placed on it, now spending its last reserves without restraint. It hit the space between them in a widening, area effect wave of darkness, not targeted, but encompassing. The kind of attack that didn't require aim because it was designed to make the entire space uninhabitable. The permacrete around them fractured under the pressure of it. The conduit junction above threw sparks. The artificial rain evaporated on contact in hissing curtains of steam. Mace took it on his blade, Vapad drinking the darkness the way it was built to. The purple blade singing with conducted energy that fed back into his strikes. But the volume of it was beyond a single blade's absorption capacity, and the nature of it was different from lightning, less structured, harder to channel cleanly. He was managing it, not neutralizing it. Anakin walked through it, not around. Through, he moved into the storm the way he had moved into everything in his life that had tried to stop him, not with the frantic urgency of someone who didn't know if they'd make it, but with the particular forward momentum of a man who had already, in some fundamental sense, decided. The dark energy hit his blade and his arm and his shoulder, and he converted what he could and absorbed what he couldn't and kept moving, and what kept him moving was not the Force, or not only the Force. It was the choice made in a hangar. It was the bow. It was Padmé's hand in his, already strategizing. It was Fox sitting down in the dirt and then standing up again. It was two dead Jedi Masters on an office floor, and the understanding that the weight of their deaths was not a debt to be repaid in anger, but a reason to ensure this ended cleanly, without cruelty, without the addition of one more thing to grieve. He reached Palpatine in 7 steps. The storm peaked in those last 2 steps. Everything Palpatine had left. Every reserve drawn from places in the dark side that were themselves being depleted in real time. A genuine force maelstrom in miniature that would have stopped any other being on this planet. Anakin's blade found its angle on the 3rd step. Precise, considered. The arc he chose was the arc of a man who had thought about what justice looked like, not what revenge felt like. And the difference between those two things was visible in the quality of the motion. No rage in it, no triumph, none of the melodrama that the moment, cinematically, seemed to invite. Clean, decisive, final. Darth Sidious, Sheev Palpatine, Dark Lord of the Sith, architect of the Clone Wars, engineer of a civilization's slow surrender, to its own fear, hit the rain-slicked permacrete of Coruscant's underworld, and did not get up. The storm stopped. The dark side energy that had been building for 1,000 years of Sith patience, that had crested in a Senate opera box and a Chancellor's office and a dozen quiet conversations designed to feel like friendship, dissipated in the space of a breath. Not dramatically. Not with the operatic dissolution of a man who had believed in drama until the end. It simply stopped. Because he did. The conduit junction above continued to drip. The artificial rain fell in its thin curtains through the amber light. Somewhere several levels above them, Coruscant continued its 10 trillion conversations, its traffic patterns, its permanent indifferent noise. The city that never dimmed, never quieted, never stopped moving, carrying on in complete ignorance of what had just ended in its basement. Anakin stood still, his blade extinguished. His arm where the dark energy had hit it was numb from the shoulder down, not damaged beyond repair. He assessed with the cold mechanical clarity of a man who had been inventorying his own injuries since he was 9 years old. But present, a fact to be addressed. He stood with his arm at his side and let the stillness of the space settle around him. The Force was very quiet. Not empty. He had felt the Force's emptiness before, in moments of grief and loss. And this was different. This was the specific quality of a silence that had been waiting a long time to be possible. A note that could not be played until everything surrounding it had resolved. Balance. Not as a word. Not as a concept from a prophecy recited in council chambers by men who had debated its meaning for decades. Balance as a felt sensation, as a thing the body knew before the mind had language for it, the way a held breath resolves when it finally releases. He breathed. The rain fell. Mace appeared at his shoulder. He did not speak. He placed his hand, his right hand, the one that had held a purple blade for 60 years, on Anakin's shoulder, and the weight of it was the weight of acknowledgement, of one man telling another that he saw what had just been done, and understood what it had cost, and had no words adequate to the moment, and was not going to pretend otherwise. They stood there for a moment in the amber light of Coruscant's underworld, in the artificial rain, beside what remained of 1,000 years of darkness. Then Anakin looked up, toward the levels above, toward the city, toward everything that still needed doing. "We should go," he said. Mace's hand dropped from his shoulder. They went. The Jedi Temple at first light, the 5 spires rising above Coruscant's cityscape in the gray pre-dawn, the ancient stone catching the earliest edge of sunrise along their eastern faces, amber light on 10,000 years of architecture, on carvings worn smooth by centuries of hands, on the steps where generations of children had arrived carrying nothing but the Force, and whatever fear they'd been too young to name. The temple did not look like a fortress. It had never needed to. Tonight, it would have to be one. Anakin was already at the gate when the first guard transports cleared the approach corridor. He had been back from 500 Republica for 40 minutes, had returned to find the temple's interior already reconfigured in the quiet, efficient manner of people who had been expecting something without knowing its exact shape. This had been Mace's work, begun the moment the gunship left for the executive building. 3 council members repositioned from their quarters to defensible interior positions. Non-combat personnel, archivists, healers, the training staff moved to the temple's lower interior levels. The youngling cohorts relocated to the deep meditation chambers, 200 meters of stone between them, and whatever came through the outer doors. Most critically, the clone garrison reduced. Not removed. Removing the garrison entirely would have triggered exactly the alert they needed to avoid. But the 32 clones who had been rotated to exterior posts over the course of the evening had been quietly redistributed to interior maintenance assignments. Plausible, undramatic. The kind of shift change that generated no flags in the guards' monitoring systems. What remained at the temple's outer perimeter were 12 clones, carefully selected, whose behavior in the preceding weeks had given Anakin the most reason to trust them. He had stood in front of that selection, and understood, coldly, that trust was a probabilistic judgment, and not a guarantee, and proceeded anyway. Because the alternative was treating every clone soldier who had fought beside him for 3 years as an enemy, and he was not willing to do that. The transport stopped 200 meters from the outer gate. Coruscant Guard. 4 transports, battalion configuration, roughly 120 troopers, their white armor catching the pre-dawn gray, their formation clean and disciplined, and entirely unconscious of the fact that the men inside it were not entirely themselves. They deployed in textbook assault configuration, 2 flanking elements moving to bracket the temple's outer wall, a center element holding the gate approach, a command unit establishing a forward position at the rear of the center formation. Commander Fox was not present. Anakin noted this. The center element's acting commander raised a vocoder-amplified voice across the 200 meters between them. By order of the Republic Executive Security Directorate, this facility is to be placed under administrative hold pending investigation of Jedi Order activities. All personnel will stand down and submit to custody. Resistance will be treated as confirmation of hostile intent. Anakin stood at the gate with his hands at his sides and his blade unlit. He looked at the formation across the 200 meters of temple approach and saw what he always saw when he looked at clone troopers, the specific posture of men who had been trained from birth to be good at this, who were good at this, who in any other context were exactly the soldiers he had fought beside on 100 worlds. He knew the way they stood. He knew the way they breathed before an operation. He knew, specifically, that the trooper third from the left in the center element had a habit of shifting his weight to his right foot when he was nervous, and he was doing it now, which meant some part of him, some part beneath the conditioning, knew something was wrong with what he was being asked to do. "I know most of you," Anakin said. He did not raise his voice to vocoder volume. He raised it enough to carry across 200 meters of still pre-dawn air, which was sufficient. "Not all of you by designation, but I know your formation. I know how the 501st holds a perimeter and how the Coruscant Guard deploys center heavy when they're expecting a bottleneck. I know that Commander Thorne's third element keeps a 2-meter interval on the flanks, and Fox's command unit always goes center rear." He paused. "I know you. You are not my enemies tonight. Something has made you think you are. It is wrong, and I am asking you to give me time to prove it." The acting commander's response was to signal the advance. Anakin moved. Not toward them, across the gate's face, drawing the advance element's attention and formation like a current drawing debris, his blade now lit and angled low and non-aggressive, but present, a fact in the space between them. He used the force in long lateral sweeps, not targeting, not striking, but pushing, broad concussive waves that hit the advancing center element and stopped their momentum without throwing them, without harm, the force equivalent of a hand pressed flat against a chest. They pushed back. They were trained for this. Anakin pushed again, harder, and the center element slowed to a fighting advance rather than a tactical march, which bought him 8 seconds. 8 seconds in which he was also talking. Fox sent a signal from the containment facility. You know he did, your command channels logged it. What you don't know is that Fox didn't choose to send it. Something reached into him and used the chip in his skull to key that transmission. And the same architecture is active in every one of you right now, waiting for the next trigger. That is what Fives tried to tell us 14 months ago. That is what we didn't listen to. I'm asking you to listen now. Not to stand down permanently. Give me 20 minutes. The right flank element hit the outer wall. Mace was there. He moved along the wall's inner face with a precision that the exterior element couldn't see and couldn't account for. The temple's own architecture providing the cover, the ancient stone channeling sound in ways that 400 years of Jedi habitation had mapped completely. He did not ignite his blade. He used the Force to bar the 3 access points along the wall's eastern section. Heavy durasteel maintenance doors that had not been sealed in decades grinding closed on hydraulic assists that the temple system still remembered how to operate. The flanking element lost its entry vectors. They did not lose their momentum. They began cutting. The lightsaber through a sealed door was a slower process than the holodramas suggested. The door's composition mattered. And these were military-grade durasteel, and the guard troopers were using blaster cutters rather than lightsabers, which were slower still. Mace calculated 7 minutes before the first door gave way, and adjusted the interior response accordingly, moving 2 of the council members to the secondary corridor positions, keeping the approaches covered without concentrating defenders in ways that made them targets. Inside the temple, the youngling cohorts were silent in the deep meditation chambers. Anakin could feel them, 200 small presences in the Force, quiet the way children go quiet, when they understand without being told that quiet is what the situation requires. The feeling of them, small and calm and trusting in the stone above them, moved through him like something sharp. He drove another Force push into the center element, and bought 3 more seconds and kept talking. "Tech," he said, pulling a designation from the advancing formation's specific positioning. "You were at Teth. 3rd Platform Assault. I pulled you out of a B-2 ambush in the canyon approach, and you told me that if you ever had to choose between a bad order and a worse one, you'd find a third option." He held the center element's advance to a crawl through continuous lateral pressure. "This is the third option. 20 minutes. Let me fix this." The trooper designated Tech, 3rd from the left, weight still on his right foot, stopped advancing. He did not stand down. He did not raise his weapon. He stopped, in the middle of a disciplined assault formation, and the 2 troopers immediately beside him slowed in the automatic response of soldiers whose spacing instinct registered a change in their element. It was not a ceasefire. It was a crack. Mace's voice came through the temple's internal calm, direct. The voice of a man managing a complex system with too many variables and not enough time, which was the voice Mace used for everything, because everything eventually came down to this. "Gate position is holding. East wall has 4 minutes. I need the solution before the door gives." Anakin looked at the center element, at the crack in its advance, at the trooper standing still, at the 100+ men behind him who were not those men right now, but were also, in some real and recoverable sense, entirely those men. "I know," he said to both Mace, and to the formation, and to the situation itself. "Working on it." The temple held. The doors held, the clones pressed, and the Jedi pushed back without killing anyone, and the standoff stretched in the gray pre-dawn light, while somewhere in the temple's lower levels, the answer to all of this was either findable or it wasn't. It had to be findable. The alternative was a choice Anakin had already decided, in a hangar earlier tonight, he was not going to make. The Jedi Temple Communications Center. A circular room 2 levels below the main hall, its walls lined with relay equipment that dated in some sections to the Old Republic, newer systems grafted onto older ones over generations. The architecture of an institution that had lasted long enough to outlive several iterations of its own technology. Banks of screens showed exterior feeds, the east wall door still holding. The center element's advance stalled at 60 meters from the gate, the flanking units cycling through entry attempts with the methodical patience of soldiers who had been told this objective was achievable and had not yet been given reason to doubt it. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood in the center of the room with dust from Utapau still on his boots. He had landed 20 minutes ago, his fighter touching down on the temple's upper platform in the middle of an alert klaxon, which was not how he had expected this evening to conclude, and Obi-Wan Kenobi had expected a great many things about this evening. The debrief of Grievous's death. A report to the Council. Sleep, eventually, the specific deep sleep of a mission completed. Instead, he stood in the communications center looking at his former Padawan, who was standing over a disassembled relay node with his mechanical right hand buried in its circuitry, and his eyes focused somewhere past the physical components into the architecture underneath them. The expression on his face, the one Obi-Wan recognized from 20 years of watching Anakin Skywalker encounter a problem. That required him to be smarter than the problem. "How long?" Obi-Wan asked. "I don't know yet." "Anakin, I said I don't know yet, not sharp." The distracted honesty of a man whose attention was genuinely elsewhere. "Ask me something I can answer." Obi-Wan looked at the exterior feeds. The east wall door had developed a visible seam along its lower edge. He looked at Anakin. "What do you need?" Anakin pulled his hand from the relay node and straightened. His mechanical fingers were trailing a length of hair-thin fiber optic cabling he had extracted from the node's secondary bus, and he held it up to the room's light with the particular focus of a man reading something others couldn't see. Fives described the chips as responding to some kind of activation signal. Something external. Something that reached into the clones and substituted a predetermined behavioral architecture for their own judgment. He didn't have the technical language for it. He was working from what it felt like from the inside, not what it looked like from the outside. He set the cable down. I don't know exactly how the signal works. Nobody does. That's why Fives died unbelieved. Because he couldn't give anyone something they could measure. But he described the moment of activation as hearing something on a channel he didn't know his equipment could receive. He moved to the room's central console and pulled up the medical archive files, Fives's case, the documentation from his autopsy. The suppressed ARC Trooper investigation that had been filed by a Republic medical officer 14 months ago, and quietly buried in a classified subdirectory that Anakin had spent 10 minutes finding in the temple's own archive. That's a frequency description. That's thin, and I know it's thin. But it's what we have. And we have 4 minutes. He looked at Obi-Wan. I'm going to try to find that frequency and flood it. Not a counter-command. I don't know enough to do that, and I don't have the Sith command architecture to issue one even if I did. But if I can identify the band the chips are listening on and saturate it completely, the activation signal, whatever it is, won't be able to get through the noise. It may not work. It's built on one dead soldier's description of what he felt and whatever R2 can find in 14-month-old equipment logs. A beat. But it's the only angle I can see that doesn't end with someone dead. R2-D2 was already in the corner of the room, interfaced with the temple's systems through a floor access port, his dome rotating with the focused urgency of a droid who had decided this situation warranted maximum processing priority. He emitted a sequence of tones. He says the clone helmet comm array operates on a primary band between 140 and 160 MHz. The console's translation system rendered. Secondary receivers extend to 200. He's found an anomalous registration in Fives's equipment logs, a signal spike at 178.4 MHz recorded in the 30 seconds before the reported behavioral incident. 178.4, Anakin said. He was already moving, already pulling the temple's long-range transmitter array into the console's active configuration. Outside the primary comm band, the clones wouldn't hear it as communication. They'd receive it as background radiation, Obi-Wan said. Background radiation that their chips may be tuned to treat as a trigger. Anakin's hands moved across the console with a speed that made his mechanical fingers an advantage rather than a prosthetic, 12 simultaneous inputs. The transmitter array's configuration changing in real time as he worked. I need to generate a broadband saturation signal centered on 178.4 that's strong enough to overwhelm whatever is using that frequency across the entire Coruscant comm grid. Not just the temple perimeter. All guard units in range. If I'm wrong about the mechanism, nothing changes and we're out of options. If I'm right, or close enough to right, the override can't execute, Obi-Wan said. That's the theory. Anakin did not look up from the console. It's the best theory I have. Obi-Wan looked at the transmitter array's power requirements on the secondary screen. The numbers were not small. That will draw from the temple's primary power systems, he said. Yes. Including the systems running the suppression fields in the outer perimeter emitters. Anakin stopped. The calculation moved through his face in real time. The suppression field emitters on the temple's outer wall were part of the same power network as the long-range transmitter array. Running the broadcast at the required power level would pull current from the emitters for an estimated 40 seconds before the temple's backup systems compensated. 40 seconds in which the clone troopers at the outer wall would be operating without the concussive suppression field that had been keeping the gate approach controlled. Mace needs to know, Obi-Wan said. Anakin was already on the comm. Temple defense, gate position, I need you to pull back inside the outer wall. 40-second window, full perimeter exposure, no emitter support. How long do you need? Mace's voice came back without hesitation. 60 seconds to reposition. You have 45. A beat. I know. Do it. Anakin looked at the console. At the transmitter array configuration. At the frequency locked on 178.4 MHz, the broadband saturation parameters set. The power draw calculated to the last decimal. He looked at Obi-Wan. Fives died trying to tell us this, he said. Not a preamble. Not a speech. The quiet statement of a man placing a fact in front of himself so he could look at it squarely. He was right. He was right about all of it, and he died alone and unbelieved. and we are about to find out if his account of what he felt in the 30 seconds before they took him down is enough to save 120 men from the thing he couldn't save himself from. Obi-Wan held his gaze. Yes, he said, simply and without qualification. Anakin nodded once. Then his hands moved across the console in the specific way they moved when he had made a decision, and the decision was irrevocable, and the only remaining question was execution. And Obi-Wan had seen those hands do this in the cockpit of a starfighter over Coruscant, and in the engine bay of a cruiser in the middle of a fleet engagement, and in 100 moments that had required Anakin Skywalker to be the most technically gifted human being Obi-Wan had ever known, and he had always been equal to those moments, and he was equal to this one. The transmitter array powered up. The console's output display climbed through its scale in 4 seconds. 20%, 40%, 60%. The numbers moving with the smooth inevitability of a system doing exactly what it had been configured to do. The lights in the communications center dimmed as the power draw hit the temple's main grid. On the exterior feeds, the suppression field emitters along the outer wall went dark. The clones at the gate felt it immediately. Not the signal. Not yet. The absence of the suppression pressure they had been pushing against. The resistance dropped out from under their advance, and the center element moved forward 6 steps before their formation discipline reasserted, and they held. 6 steps. 34 meters from the gate, the transmitter array reached 100%. The broadcast lasted 8 seconds. On the exterior feeds it looked like nothing. No visible effect. No dramatic visual confirmation. No sign that anything had changed in the gray pre-dawn air around the temple's outer perimeter. The clone troopers stood in their formation, and the formation stood in the early light, and the temple's ancient stone sat above it all unchanged. Then Commander Fox, present after all. Having arrived at the rear of the center element in the last 10 minutes, his designation registering on the temple's external sensors, sat down on the ground. Not fell. Sat. The deliberate, exhausted motion of a man whose legs have decided that standing is no longer the priority. His helmet came off in the same motion, both hands working the seals with the automatic efficiency of a soldier who has done this 10,000 times, and underneath it, his face, was the face of a man surfacing from deep water, disoriented, blinking, the specific blankness of someone trying to locate himself in time and place. Around him by ones and twos and then in clusters, the Coruscant guard sat down. Some of them removed their helmets. Some of them didn't. Some of them looked at the temple's outer wall and then at their own hands, and then at the troopers beside them with the particular expression of men who are doing the arithmetic of what they nearly did, and arriving at a number that doesn't resolve cleanly. Fox looked up at the gate. Anakin was standing at it. He had moved from the communication center in the 40-second window, had known, without being told, that this moment required a face and not a comm channel. He stood at the gate with his blade extinguished, and his hands visible at his sides, and looked at the commander sitting in the dirt 34 meters away. Fox's voice, when it came, was rough. Not from the signal. From what was underneath the signal's absence. General Skywalker. A pause that carried the weight of a man trying to find language for something that had no established vocabulary. I need someone to tell me what I did tonight. You were used, Anakin said, by something that was put in you without your knowledge or consent, in service of a war you didn't choose and didn't understand. What you did tonight is not yours. He held the commander's gaze across the 34 meters of pre-dawn light. What you do next is. Fox looked at his hands. Then he stood up. Guard units, he said, his voice carrying the command register that years of authority had made automatic. Stand down. Weapons safe. We are done here. The temple siege ended not with the guard defeated, but with the guard themselves ending it, 120 soldiers standing down by their own commander's order, in the gray light of a Coruscant morning, freed from the thing that had been waiting in their skulls since before they knew what waiting was. Obi-Wan appeared at Anakin's shoulder. Fives would have appreciated that, he said quietly. Anakin looked at the guard units standing down across the temple approach, at Fox replacing his helmet, at the trooper who had been shifting his weight to his right foot, now standing still, at 120 men beginning the slow process of accounting for a night they had not chosen. Yes, he said. He would have. Naboo, 3 weeks later. The lake country in the hour before noon, the water catching the light in long flat plains of silver and gold. The hills above the lake were green in the specific way that things are green when they have never been anything else. Not recovered, not restored, just continuously, quietly alive. A pair of birds crossed the sky above the tree line moving south, unhurried. The air smelled of water and cut grass and the particular warmth of stone that has been in the sun since early morning. The war was over. It had not ended with ceremony, or not primarily with ceremony. It had ended the way most things end when the force sustaining them is removed, gradually, then quickly, the separatist military command structure collapsing over 72 hours as the financial architecture underwriting it dissolved, and the political will animating it evaporated, and the generals who had believed they were fighting for a cause discovered, in the space of 3 days, that the cause had been a managed fiction from the first engagement to the last. Padmé had spoken to the emergency Senate session. Bail had managed the parliamentary mechanics. Mon Mothma had drafted the armistice framework. The Clone Wars, which had consumed 3 years and more lives than the Republic's Census Bureau had yet finished counting, ended in a document signed in a temporary chamber in the Senate Rotunda by representatives of both sides who were, for the most part, as exhausted as everyone else. The twins had been born 4 days after Palpatine's death, both of them healthy, both of them present in the Force, in the specific, distinct way that Anakin had felt from the moment he knew they existed, 2 separate lights. Both clear, both strong, both entirely and completely themselves. Luke, who arrived first and immediately objected to the situation with considerable volume. Leia, who arrived second and looked at the world with an expression of focused assessment that Padmé said was entirely familiar, and Anakin said he had no idea what she meant. He knew exactly what she meant. The Jedi Council convened in the Lake House's main room, which was not a council chamber, and did not try to be one. The furniture was Naboo provincial, warm wood, worn fabric, the accumulated comfort of a house that had been lived in and used, and not preserved. The 12 masters arranged themselves as the space permitted, some seated, some standing. Yoda occupying a chair by the window with the quality of presence he carried everywhere, that specific weight of accumulated centuries that made a room feel like it had been there longer than it had. Mace stood in the center. He did not carry prepared remarks. What he carried was the expression of a man who has spent 3 weeks thinking about what to say, and arrived at the conclusion that the honest version was the only version worth giving. "The Order failed Anakin Skywalker," he said. No preamble, no qualification. The words placed on the air the way Mace placed everything, directly, without decoration. Because decoration would have implied that the statement required softening, and it didn't. We failed him systematically, over years, in ways that were each individually defensible and collectively indefensible. We assigned our institutional anxiety to his potential and called it discernment. We withheld trust because we feared what trusting him might cost us, without accounting for what withholding it would cost him. He paused, what it nearly cost all of us. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the lake moved in the light. The council is not infallible. We demonstrated that comprehensively. What we can be, what this order can be, is honest about the demonstration and willing to change because of it. Not in our structure alone. In our philosophy. In the premise that attachment is weakness, and that a Jedi who loves something is a Jedi already compromised. He looked around the room. A man who loves his family fought beside me through the longest night of my life and helped save this galaxy. I will not construct a philosophy that treats that as a problem to be managed. Ki-Adi-Mundi opened his mouth. Mace looked at him. Ki-Adi-Mundi closed his mouth. Anakin, standing near the door with his arms loose at his sides, felt something move through him that was not quite amusement and not quite vindication, and was, in the end, simply relief. The specific, unfamiliar relief of a man hearing the truth spoken plainly in a room that had previously specialized in its careful avoidance. Mace turned to face him directly. Anakin Skywalker. The formal address. The council voice, but carrying something underneath it that the council voice did not usually carry. You came to us with the most dangerous truth in the galaxy, and trusted us with it at the moment that trust cost you the most. You fought beside us without reservation. You chose partnership over power at every decision point when power was available and partnership required something harder. A beat. The Council acted with less wisdom than the Padawan we never deserved. He reached to his belt. The lightsaber he held out was not a weapon. It was a formality, and formalities mattered, and Mace Windu understood this in the specific way that a man understands things he has spent decades both practicing and occasionally failing. By unanimous decision of the Jedi High Council, and with the acknowledgement that this recognition is overdue and that overdue is a charitable characterization, Anakin Skywalker, you are hereby granted the rank of Jedi Master. The room was still. Anakin looked at the lightsaber, at Mace's face, at the assembled council arranged in the warm light of a Naboo morning in a lake house that smelled of cut grass and infant twins, who were sleeping in the next room, and a life that was, against every reasonable expectation, intact. He thought about a hangar. Emergency red lighting. His hands shaking and the force around him like a held breath. A choice between the old reflex and something harder and more honest, and the 4 seconds in which he'd found the harder thing and taken it. He took the lightsaber. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, carrying the weight of a man who knows what they cost to receive, and what it cost to earn the right to say them without irony. Then he held the lightsaber back out. Mace looked at it. "I accept the rank," Anakin said. "I want to be clear that I accept it, and that it matters to me that the Council gave it." He paused, finding the words not because they were difficult, but because they deserved to be said precisely. "And I'm stepping back from active field duty. Effective immediately, and not as a protest or a departure, as a choice." He looked at the room. "I have 2 children who are 4 days old. I have a wife who has spent 3 years being the political half of a partnership while I played soldier, and she has things to teach me about how this galaxy actually works that I suspect will take years to learn properly. And I have, for the first time in my life, a future that is not about surviving the present." He lowered the lightsaber. "A Jedi Master can choose what he masters," he said. "I'm choosing this." Yoda made a sound from his chair by the window. Not words. The specific sound Yoda made when something had been said that he had been waiting a very long time to hear and was not going to diminish by adding to it. Obi-Wan, standing at the room's far edge, looked at his former Padawan with the expression of a man watching someone he has known since childhood finally, completely, arrive at themselves. He said nothing. His expression said everything. Anakin met his eyes, and they held for a moment, and 20 years of training and war and brotherhood passed between them, in the wordless way such things pass between people who have been through enough together that language is a supplement rather than a requirement. The lake at noon. Padmé sat on the dock with her feet above the water, and Luke in her arms, who had fallen asleep between one moment and the next with the absolute commitment to unconsciousness that only very young humans achieve. Leia was in a basket beside her, awake, studying the sky with the focused assessment that had already, in 4 days, become her signature mode of engaging with the world. Anakin sat beside Padmé with no particular agenda for the first time in recent memory. The sound of footsteps on the dock behind them, 2 sets, unhurried, the specific cadence of people who have been invited and are not in a hurry to leave. Mace settled on the dock's edge with the careful economy of a large man sitting somewhere not designed for it. Obi-Wan sat beside him, looked at the lake, and visibly decided that this was, on balance, a good place to be. They sat for a while without speaking. The water moved. The birds crossed the sky again, still moving south, still unhurried. Luke slept. Leia considered the universe, and found it, provisionally, acceptable. "You know," Obi-Wan said, eventually, to no one in particular, "I have been in the field continuously for 3 years, and I cannot remember the last time I simply sat somewhere." "You're sitting now," Padmé said. "I am," he agreed. "It's remarkable." Mace looked at the lake, at the twins, at Anakin beside Padmé with his mechanical hand resting open on the dock, palm up, the posture of a man with nothing to guard and nothing to hide, and nowhere else to be. "You're going to be an appalling Jedi Master," Mace said, "by every traditional metric." "I know," Anakin said. "Good. Mace said. The traditional metrics needed revision. The lake held the noon light and gave it back without taking anything from it. The hills were green. The sky was clear. The galaxy beyond this dock and this water and these 4 people and these 2 sleeping and assessing children was imperfect and damaged, and in the long process of accounting for 3 years of a war fought on false premises. But it was also, provisionally, at peace. The Chosen One closed his eyes. The Force was still, not the stillness of a held breath, the stillness of one that had finally, after everything, been released. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.